Ralph Laviolette. I'm the volunteer archivist for Bayfield Historical Society. Well, Bayfield has an interesting history. It's different from the Canada Company history. John Galt came here as a reparations agent for the Crown, and in his reparations workings from the War of 1812-1814, he went back to England, and lo and behold, the treasury was empty after the war with Napoleon. And so the interest peaked in terms of some of the things he had seen when he came to Canada, which was in a part of England, really. And so he began the Canada Company. And Canada Company eventually bought 1 million acres of land that they called the Huron Tract or Huron Block, comprising, starting off in Guelph, what's the area now in Guelph, and coming up to Goderich, and Goderich was their chosen harbour. Around the same time, a man called De Tile, who was from the House of Orange, was hanging around or knew of the English court and so on, and met a man called Bayfield. And De Tile was interested in setting up some kind of arrangement in the New World as well, and was interested in, he was an entrepreneurial spirit, and was interested in finding a place to be in the New World. And so he asked Bayfield if there was a good spot for a place to begin a little village. And Bayfield thought of the outlet of the Bayfield River, which is about 12 miles south of Goderich, knowing that the Canada Company was going to settle in Goderich as its main centre and terminus on Lake Huron. And so De Tile bought about 700 or 800 acres of land here in Bayfield. He also settled and built a baronetcy, if you will, on the Medicine River in Goderich, and that was his main location. And so Bayfield was one of those centres, along with probably Goderich and perhaps Grand Bend and other places, but Bayfield had an excellent harbour for taking away grains and so on, and a number of grain merchants began their businesses here. We had 3 grain merchants that we know of. And they began to attract farmers who would bring their grains to Bayfield and so on, and so it began as a little commercial enterprise that way. And it went along quite well for about 20 or 30 years until the railways came by, and the railways decided, albeit that the Bayfield business people were trying to talk the railways into coming to Bayfield, but they decided to bypass Bayfield and go through Brucefield, which is about 12 miles away. And when that happened, the town's fortunes died away pretty quickly in terms of being an agricultural center. And fishermen began to use the harbour more and more. And so we've had about something of the order of about 12 or 15 fishing families here that we have very old roots, that we've learned about. And yeah, that's how Bayfield began in terms of using its harbour and its river and so on. In the 1880s and 1890s, it's a very popular spot, both for bicycle groups from London and the Golden Horseshoe areas and so on, coming on excursions on weekends, and also Americans coming and establishing their little cottages and hideaways and so on. At the very beginning, it started as a holiday area, but at the very beginning, farmers used to, because this was an agricultural sort of center, farmers used to bring their families to the shore, and on the north shore here, they formed what was called White Tent City. And it was where they'd bring their families, and the families would tent over there in the summer periods and so on. And from that began the sort of the resort sort of atmosphere that we've had all along. Yeah. We're the largest pleasure boat marina area on the Great Lakes now, something like about 800 or 900 berths here. So our village blossoms out to about 2,000 or 3,000 people in the summertime. And it's a small town, but it sees a lot of people, yeah. And we have many shops here and so on, so it's a favorite spot for day trips up from London and so on, yeah.
the harbor has evolved over a period of almost 200 years now, since it was first discovered by the Europeans in the early 1820s. So following 1825, the land surveyors made their way here from inland on behalf of the Canada Company, mapping out a passageway through the so-called Huron Tract, a piece of land involving about a million acres that was to be developed and settled. And what they discovered was the mouth of a river. The river by the First Nations people was called the Menasatong River. The locals, when they started coming here, called it the Red River. The government officials, when they officially named it, called it the Maitland River. And that was, in fact, the first harbor that we had. It was entered by the gunship B, which brought John Galt, the first superintendent of the Canada Company, here from Penetanguishene up around the Bruce Peninsula. And when they decided they had arrived at the right place, they looked inshore and they could see a log cabin on top of a bluff, which happened to be the temporary dwelling place of a guy named Tiger Dunlop, who was associated with the founding of Goderich. And Galt, after the course of an hour, worked his way on this gunship around a sandbar and an island and found a natural harbor inside the opening of the river, about 12 feet deep. And they decided that there was a great potential there to be used as a commercial port, and determined that this was an ideal location for a harbor.
In the early years of settlement, the settlement pattern was kind of unique in the western part of the Huron Tract, because the settlers before the Huron Road had to settle from west to east rather than the traditional pattern of settlement east to west, until the Huron Road was built in about 1832. In the early years, of course, the first ships coming in brought in settlers, and it took out lumber, fish, grain as commercial trade throughout the rest of Canada and North America.
Well, the Canada Company, which was a land development company, saw a great potential for two or three things. They wanted to use the harbor as a station to which to bring settlers, and they actually, in their first year of operation here, started to build a sidewheel steamer with the expectation that it would travel a route from Buffalo, receiving settlers coming into the continent through the Erie Barge Canal to the lakes, and then shortcutting the overland route and bringing them by boat via Detroit and then Fort Gratiot, which we now know as Port Huron, to Goderich as their ultimate destination.
The only time that Huron County soil has been violated from an invader was in a raid on June 18th, 1838. When a few dozen self-styled patriots tried to liberate Canada from British rule. The only thing they managed to liberate was the Canada Company stores down at the wharf. They sailed away, but were captured on Walpole Island, and Colonel John S. Freeland, their leader, was sentenced to a year imprisonment. It's fortunate they were picked up by American authorities, because had they have been captured in Canada and arrested and tried, they probably would have been hanged for piracy. 1866 is a pivotal year in the port's history. In that year, in June, we had the Fenian excitement. After the Civil War, it was feared that the Fenian Brotherhood would invade the town of Goderich, and there is a rumor that flew around the area that the Fenians were on their way in, so hundreds of militiamen from around southwestern Ontario gathered at the port. They dug trenches, brought artillery, and were expecting an attack at any moment. The Fenians never showed up, but General William Tecumseh Sherman did, who was, of course, the Civil War general, and he was stationed at Chicago. When he came into the harbor, he came in unannounced, but he tried to calm Canadian fears that they would take care of that they would not support any sort of Fenian incursion into Canadian soil. The result of that was that the British colonial authorities weren't too happy, we don't think, with General Sherman's impromptu visit, and they sent a gunboat, the HMS Cherub, and it was stationed in Goderich from 1866 to 68. And in that time, the HMS Cherub, they trained local crews from Goderich and Clinton and the area as seamen and Marines aboard what would become the Dominion gunboat service. The Prince Alfred and the Rescue were headquartered here in Goderich. And Goderich could rightfully make a claim to being the cradle of the Royal Canadian Navy because we had the first generation of seamen and sailors. The other great event of 1866, which still impacts Goderich's economy today, was the discovery of salt. About 1.5 miles up the Maitland River, Samuel Platt and Peter McEwen, while drilling for oil, actually tapped into a salt bed that geologists call the Michigan bed. All of southern Ontario, from about Kincardine down to Windsor, is on a bed of salt. And in 1866, it started a salt boom where at one time over a dozen wells were extracting salt from the port of Goderich. Today, in 1959, the Sifto salt mine, the largest salt mine in the world, was constructed, and we still have one evaporator plant or salt well which still extracts salt the old-fashioned way by flushing warm water into the salt bed, and it comes up in a brine that gets evaporated and boiled off. So the discovery of salt in 1866 was an incredibly important economic development around the harbour and the area in general.
The Canada Company had made whatever use it could of the harbour. It built the first piers, it built the first wharves, it had the first arguments with the government about who should control what. When the railways arrived, they needed a place to receive grain and cargo from the water, and it was logical that they have control over the harbour. The unfortunate circumstance that changed it all was after the so-called spring freshet, the breakup of the river ice in 1869, which destroyed a lot of the harbour, and it actually scoured out the major portion of a 4-acre island and moved it and dumped it into the place that the boats would normally navigate through inside the harbour. Made it impossible to use it. And the federal government became involved at that stage by declaring the harbour a port of refuge, and that permitted them to make tax investments in the commercial harbour at that time and rebuild it. With the decision made to open a harbour by the Canada Company, there needed to be some way to guide ships in and out of the port. And the first lighthouse in Goderich was built inland, probably at the intersection of Coburg Street and Wellesley Street, at the large yellow brick residence, which was originally the Bank of Upper Canada, but we would know it as the Bruce Sully House. And the first wooden structure was built in that area. It worked well for ships coming from the west, but for boat traffic coming from the north, or particularly from the south, it couldn't be seen. So the first thing that had to be done was to move it. And it was relocated to a site that was right on the bluff where the current lighthouse sits today, and that's what was built.
Well, aside from the square, the Goderich Lighthouse is the town's most identifiable symbol. The light from this tower has guided into our port the ships that carried the settlers, trade, commerce, and now tourists into our port town. The current lighthouse is actually the second one. The first one was a crude log tower. However, ships had to pass the harbour mouth in order to see its light. So, in 1847, Adam McVicker, a Scottish stonemason, was contracted to build the present lighthouse on its current location. You'll notice that the Goderich Lighthouse has a unique design. It's kind of squat and square, unlike the traditional conical tower shape that one associates with lighthouses on the Great Lakes. And this is for two reasons. Number one, The Goderich Lighthouse is built on a 130-foot bluff, so it already had the light height. And secondly, for early Upper Canadian stonemasons, it was probably just a more efficient and easier design to build. In 1852, in the provincial census, the government pronounced the Goderich Lighthouse a fine stone structure, one of the best on the Great Lakes. In 1877, the whale oil lamp was replaced by silver patent lights, which gave the lighthouse a much more brilliant illumination so it could be seen out at sea. And after the inquest into the Great Storm in 1913, another 5 feet of height was added to the top of the lighthouse, and then later in 1925, electric rotating lights were added to give it the pulsating light that it has today. There was a lighthouse keeper's cottage that was occupied by the lighthouse keeper and his family until 1965, and it was torn down about 20 years later in 1985. In 2003, the Crown sold the lighthouse and surrounding parkland to the town of Goderich for the princely sum of $1. The town continues to maintain it as a navigational aid for the ships out on the Great Lakes. And as much as Goderich's character has been profoundly influenced by its proximity to the lake, the lighthouse has witnessed nearly 170 years of the town's unique maritime history. It's not an exaggeration to say that the port has grown up and developed under the lighthouse's protective beam.
It was used and depended on until the 1970s. I don't think that it was considered not useful until at least that period of time or that decade. Loran was in, that's land-based radio waves from 3 different directions intersecting to show you where you are on a body of water. Those systems were well introduced in marine navigation, and we were on the edge of GPS, I guess, as we moved into the 1980s. So it really wasn't until then that lighthouses were not needed, per se, by commercial traffic. They were certainly used by recreational traffic a lot more. And if there's been any big change, by the way, in terms of what's happening on the lakes, the reversal that's occurred over the last 100 years has been a complete reversal in the number of vessels traveling. 100 years ago, there would be a couple of thousand commercial vessels pass by the port of Goderich, if you could see from here to the other shore, in the course of any one season, and a few recreational vessels. But if you were to look at what has happened today, it would be hundreds upon hundreds of recreational vessels passing north and south. And even though they have the latest navigation aids like GPS and chart plotters and that sort of thing, they still rely on visual navigation signals. And I know when I sail from Goderich to Tobermory, I'm looking for the Goderich light when I'm coming home. I'm looking for the light at Point Clark when I'm heading up the lake, and that sort of thing. And I know that the other people in terms of recreational use it for the psychological reassurance of knowing where you are.